The French Foreign Legion was formed by royal decree on March 10, 1831, as an infantry force composed of foreign nationals to be deployed for service overseas. One of the prime reasons for its formation was to round up the many foreigners considered by the French government to be troublemakers and potential revolutionaries. Some 7 battalions were quickly raised and then sent to the French colonial enclave in North Africa, centered around the city of Algiers. At first poorly trained and led, the local French commanders initially refused to accept the Legion as a combat unit, and its men languished as common laborers. They were stationed in some of the more unhealthy spots around Algiers. Disease was rampant and deaths frequent. But renewed attempts by the Arab population to eject the French brought a demand for frontline troops and a change in the Legion's fortunes. After a short time, they demonstrated they could be an effective fighting force. However, soon afterwards, the bulk of the Legion was dispatched to Spain in 1835 to fight in a civil war called the First Carlist War. Of the approximately 5,000 legionnaires sent to fight in the Carlist War, only 159 frontline soldiers returned to France in January 1839. Meanwhile, what remained of the Legion in North Africa soon found itself engaged in a full-scale war with the Arab leader, Abd el-Kader. In June 1835, the French were defeated at the Battle of Makta, and to maintain the now tenuous hold over their North African possessions, reinforcements were rushed to Algiers. The Kabyle tribes were among France's fiercest opponents, and the mountainous stronghold of Constantine became a focus of opposition. In 1837, the French laid siege to Constantine. Surrounded on 3 sides by near-vertical cliffs, it could only be approached from the south. And it was here that the massed French artillery was able to make a breach in the city's walls. Among the French troops waiting to attack the breach was a Legion battalion under the command of Major Bedeau. One of Bedeau's company commanders, Captain Achille Leroy de Saint-Arnaud, was an ambitious officer determined to make his mark in the North African campaign. In a letter to his brother, Saint-Arnaud described the Legionnaires' assault on Constantine.
We had just arrived at the breach when there was a shattering explosion, followed by the silence of the grave. Those still on their feet were staggering, blinded by gravel, powder, momentarily suffocated. In a matter of seconds, however, a terrible spectacle was enacted before our eyes. Those wounded but still capable of walking appeared, crying out with pain from the debris. I was amazed that our men stood firm. Combes and Bedeau raised their swords. I heard them shouting, "Forward! Forward!" I took up the cry myself, calling out to my men, "To me, the Legion! At them with the bayonet! Forward! Forward!" and began to run towards the swirling clouds of smoke, expecting to be blown to bits, convinced as I was that a second mine would go up at any moment. 7 Turks were firing at us from loopholes in the walls. They discharged their muskets in our faces, but we bayoneted them as they were trying to reload. There was no question of taking prisoners. I then doubled my men in the direction of the heaviest firing and arrived outside the house of Ben Aissa, the Bey's lieutenant. Major Bedeau was there already, and as we looked for the best way to penetrate still more deeply into the town, bullets rained down on us, bouncing like hail off the cobbles.
While Bedeau and Saint-Arnaud rallied their legionnaires, news reached them of the erection of a barricade at the end of an alley, where the Kabyle defenders were going to make their last stand. Saint-Arnaud continues his account.
Advancing towards the end of the alley, I saw that we were being held up by a barricade consisting of wrenched-off doors, beams, and mattresses. Everything one could think of, defended ferociously by the Kabyles. Going back to my men, I told them that by charging with the bayonet, they would lose far fewer than by creeping forward and firing ineffectually into a pile of mattresses. I then put my marksmen into houses from which they could fire over the barricades down to the defenders, and sword in hand, shouting, "Forward the Legion!" charged. I reached the barricade, climbed it, and fell flat on my face in the middle of a group of Arabs. The fall saved my life, as the shots fired at me were too high. Even so, I was so near the musket barrels that my overcoat was singed and my scabbard hold. It was while I was still on the ground that I heard a soldier call out, "Save the captain! He's wounded!" But I got to my feet and started to carve up Turks with my sword as my men destroyed the barricade, opening up a passage into the very street that the first column had been repulsed.
Once again, Saint-Arnaud reorganized his troops and then pressed on along the street.
My first action was to establish my sharpshooters on either side, firing crossways, but men were dropping all the time. After not more than 20 paces, we were stopped by a really intense fire coming from a big house on the right, which seemed literally aflame, so continuous were the flashes coming from it. I learned later that it was the barracks of the base guard. There was nothing to do but take it by storm. We battered in the doors and plunged into the courtyard, broke into the rooms, climbed the stairs. What a sight, what slaughter, blood everywhere, not a murmur from the dying. One killed or was killed in that state of frenzy which makes a man grit his teeth and stifle a groan from the very depths of his soul.
After the house was cleared, Saint-Arnaud and the legionnaires advanced deeper into Constantine.
I was attacked by the Turk whose yataghan I sent you. His pistol was jammed and he threw himself on me, blade raised. I parried his cut, lunged, and my point entered his neck. One of my men, Keller, who was just behind me, leaped forward and plunged his bayonet into the body. At that moment he was hit by 2 bullets and the poor boy died for me, since it was at me that the bullets were aimed. A third bullet hit the greatcoat I was wearing, slung bandolier fashion. We advanced slowly against redoubled fire. In vain I tried to charge, crying, "Forward!" My men were mown down, and it was in this unhappy position that Sergeant Major Droz, at the head of a handful of volunteers, captured a banner, killing all its defenders, and thus earned the cross for which I recommended him. Again I rallied my men, and they followed me, bayonets leveled, but at last the Turks had had enough. They fled and the street was cleared. We chased them down a number of alleys until we arrived at a small square where I found Major Bédot, the battalion commander. Happy to see each other alive, we shook hands warmly. I was just going to advance down another alley when an Arab suddenly appeared waving a piece of paper and crying, "Carta! Carta!" The man was a son of a sheikh. It was all over. The town had surrendered unconditionally.
Saint-Arnaud was decorated for his bravery and stellar leadership, while the banner captured in Constantine was transferred to Paris, where it remains today. The fall of Constantine did not end Kabyle resistance, however, and fighting was to continue for the next 2 decades. In the mid-19th century, the French developed trading interests in southern Vietnam. Over time, this extended to Tonkin in the north, as well as into Cambodia and Laos. As part of the great imperialist surge in the late 19th century, France decided to incorporate these countries into its own empire in the east, French Indochina. However, in Tonkin, France would encounter fierce resistance. While nominally a Chinese protectorate, Tonkin was ruled by rival warlords and their Black Flag pirate armies. To provide military support for the conquest of Tonkin, a Legion battalion left Algeria for Indochina in 1883 to be joined by a further 2 battalions. After landing at the port of Haiphong, the Legionnaires became part of a column advancing into the Tonkinese interior. Led by Admiral Amédée Courbet, the French expeditionary force was brought to a standstill at Sontay, a well-built bamboo and earth fort manned by Chinese regulars and Black Flags. On the 16th of December 1883, after a breach had been made by French artillery, Courbet decided to assault the fort. Leading the attack was a battalion of Algerian colonial troops. British legionnaire George Mannington described their attack.
Notwithstanding the fact that these men were seasoned troops and born fighters, they were beaten back with severe loss, which speaks much to the desperate resistance offered by the Chinese garrison, some of whom were daring enough to dart out through the gap in the walls and decapitate the dead and wounded left in the track of the retreating column. The bleeding heads, placed atop of bamboo poles, were planted on the crest of the ramparts, amid the shrill, triumphant yells of the Celestials. The Arabs, reformed and stiffened by 2 companies of French Marines, rushed once more to the assault, but with no more success, and indeed with greater loss than the first time. Now the white-faced, gory-necked heads of some of the French Marines balanced side by side with the dusky, bleeding features of their African comrades. The Chinese, howling drunk with success, and heedless of the fire from the French artillery, which was covering the retreat, stood on the wall to yell defiance and invective at their enemy. Indeed, so greatly was the garrison encouraged that a sortie was made which threatened to develop into a strong attack on the flanks of the expeditionary force. The admiral then played his last and trump card, and a battalion of the Legion, which till now had formed part of the reserve, rushed at the breach with the band playing and colours flying. These troops advanced at the pas de charge and were met by a terrible fire. Many fell, but they were not to be denied. In a few minutes, the first ranks reached the edge of the ditch, and leaping down onto the slope of debris, formed by the stones and earth detached by the cannonade, they scrambled up to the breach, tore away the bamboo palisade, rushed or were pushed through it, and gained the crest. The legionnaires suffered fearful loss, and it is to be feared that, excited by this and the cruel murder of their wounded comrades, they gave little mercy to those who opposed them. Among the first to gain a footing were a subaltern bearer of the colours and big Mertens. The first was immediately shot dead, whereupon the sapper seized the flag and, rushing to the ramparts, stood on them in view of the whole army. Waving the bullet-torn, powder-stained tricolour above his head, he shouted, "Vive la Belgique! Vive la Légion!" There was something grimly comical, but truly typical, in the conduct of this mercenary, who, forgetting the country for which he was fighting, and after just risking death 100 times, coupled in his shout of triumph the name of his motherland and that of the corps to which he belonged. Mertens received the military medal for his bravery, and it is reported that Admiral Courbet, when complimenting him on the courage he had shown, said, "And you would have had the Legion of Honor had you cried, 'Vive la France!'" This last, however, is probably a soldier's yarn.
By 1885, much of Tonkin had been conquered by the French, who were now advancing towards the mountainous Chinese border. Establishing a forward base at Langson, the French commander, Colonel François Oscar de Négrier, crossed the border in March 1885 towards the Chinese position at Bongbo. There, the French were suddenly attacked by a large and determined Chinese army, and were forced back in confusion to the strong position around Langson. During the fighting, Négrier had been severely wounded, and command passed to Lieutenant Colonel Herbinger, who inexplicably ordered a withdrawal from Langson. Supplies were hurriedly destroyed to prevent them falling into Chinese hands. Lieutenant Bonmot, a Legion officer, described the scene.
An unbelievable spectacle awaited us. Barrels of wine and rum, cases of biscuits and meat, sacks of coffee, flour, open, gutted, overturned, lay over the floor. In the town there was chaos, and it seemed that this decision to leave Langson had unsettled everyone. Here one threw artillery pieces into the water, as we had neither coolies or mules to transport them, despite the protestations, the supplications of the commander, who promised to have his men drag them. Further on, the brigade chest, which contained as much as 600,000 francs, which arrived 2 days ago, was also sacrificed. It would have been easy to save this money by giving a few pieces to each man. In the citadel, we opened boxes of cartridges and threw them into the lakes.
Despite all of this, the French managed to fall back towards Hanoi in good order. In the overall picture, French control over Tonkin was far from certain, especially with the Vietnamese continually recruiting new forces to support the Chinese. However, a dramatic change of events transformed the strategic situation in favor of the French. Instead of following up their advantage, the Chinese proposed a ceasefire in April 1885 that led to the Treaty of Tientsin, in which China ceded its claim to Tonkin. This left the French with a free hand to suppress the Black Flags, although they continued to resist French forces. Assaults on forts and outposts were one of the main features of the war in Tonkin. Both sides became adept at defense and attack, developing complex fortifications and equally complex siege techniques. These forts were usually constructed from a combination of stone, bamboo, and earth. If a fort could not be taken by a straightforward assault, then siege operations would begin, complete with trench lines, saps, mines, and countermines. The siege of the French outpost of Tuyen Quang became a classic of Legion endurance, when its predominantly Legion garrison held out against a Chinese army in 1885. The Chinese had completely surrounded the fort by the 20th of January and began pushing saps towards the outpost, while digging mines to destroy the walls of the fortifications. Whenever a mine was exploded, a Chinese force would race forward into the breach, only to be repulsed by the defenders. One such Chinese attack on the 22nd of February was described by Pastor Boisseau, the garrison's chaplain.
The legionaries were not discouraged. In the twinkling of an eye, they were on the spot like lions, on that same ground bespattered with the torn flesh and watered by the blood of their brothers. They mowed down the Chinese, hurling back their mass. Once more, they taught the enemy to respect the flag of France, for each of these gallant men knew as they rushed forward into the breach that he must conquer or die.
During the attack, the Chinese had set off 3 mines that caused serious French casualties, including Captain Moulinet, who had led the Legion counterattack against the Chinese assault. As the pastor continued,
At the sound of the first detonation, Moulinet was on the rampart at the head of his men. Like the rest of his soldiers, he was blown up by the second explosion. His body described a monstrous parabola in the air, and as he landed on his feet, his thighs were wrenched out of joint and the bones driven into his groin.
On the 3rd of March, a French relief column arrived at the outpost and came upon a scene of utter devastation, shattered walls and trenches littered with the bodies of the dead from both sides. As part of a Legion company defending a fort, Sergeant John Patrick Lepore witnessed a subterranean encounter. Having failed to capture the fort in a night assault, the Chinese and Black Flag attackers dug a mine towards the fort. Aware of this, French engineers began digging a countermine to disrupt the Chinese excavation. Lepore descended the countermine pit out of curiosity.
While I was holding a whispered conversation with a sub-officer of engineers, a cry from a worker drew our attention. In a moment, the engineer saw what had happened and cried out, "The Chinese! The Chinese!" As a matter of fact, the Chinese miners and we were separated only by a thin wall of loose earth. A blow or two struck by, I know not which party tumbled this down, and we were all mixed up together, French and Chinese in the tunnel. All struck out at random. I drew my bayonet, which of course I always wore, and dashed the point in the face of a yellow man from outside. The lamps were extinguished in the struggle that ensued. We were all striking blindly about with pickaxe, shovel, and bayonet. No man knew who might receive his blow. It was a horrible time. In the darkness I heard oaths and groans. I shoved forward my bayonet. It met something soft. I drew it back and lunged again. Again it met the soft, yielding substance. Or perhaps the blow was wasted on empty air. If I struggled forward, I tripped over a body. If I went back, surely a miner would knock my brains out with his pick. This went on for a short space that seemed an eternity. At last, hurrying footsteps and shouts of encouragement and a welcoming gleam of lights told of the arrival of aid. When our comrades came up, we found that all the Chinese able to flee had fled. 14 of them, however, and 8 or 9 men of ours, were lying pressed against and on top of one another in a narrow space. All, dead and wounded alike, were carried out. The place was blocked up at once, and the countermine that had taken so much time and work on our part was filled in.
As well as being involved in formal siege operations, the French were engaged in counterinsurgency warfare, attempting to pin down and destroy the Black Flag bands in their jungle and mountain hideouts. This was no easy task, given the skill and determination of the Black Flags, who knew the terrain far better than the French. The 3 Legion battalions were in the forefront of these operations, sending columns deep into the jungle. Any legionnaires captured by the Black Flags could also expect a slow and painful end, and the threat of such a death kept many men from dropping out of a column deep in enemy territory. Officers did their best to encourage stragglers, but if a man refused or was unable to march, his rifle and ammunition were taken from him, and he was left to his fate. On some occasions, the ordinary legionnaires took things into their own hands. Antoine Silver described what could be done to those unable to keep going.
The worst thing about Tonkin was that the Legion organized light columns, nothing but a canteen, a haversack, and some bullets. There were no wagons, so if they were sick or wounded, it was awful. It was often in the worst spots where, if we left a chap, we would find him butchered by the pirates who came to play at cutting him up or to stick a pug up his ass until it came out his shoulder. Now we didn't approve of that. So when there was one who was on his last legs, we gave him a drink of tafia and then we said, "Now it's your last mouthful." We would stick the barrel in his mouth and pull the trigger. Then we could go off with a clear conscience.
A man from Lorraine who was ill was unable to keep up and was left behind unarmed. On a later march, the legionnaires trooped past the spot where the Lorrainer was abandoned, only to find his hideously mutilated body. a legionnaire named Lepoer and his comrades swore revenge.
All that day, we spoke of nothing but the horrible sight we had seen in the morning. We were angry. We made resolutions to take sharp and speedy vengeance for the death of our comrade and the indignity shown his corpse.
When they next encountered a Black Flag band, the legionnaires butchered them all.
We took a bloody vengeance on the barbarians, such a vengeance as even in the Legion was spoken of with bated breath.
By the mid-1890s, the tide of the conflict began to turn against the Black Flags. Support from Chinese sources was diminishing, and the relentless pressure of the French was taking its toll. According to Mannington, not only was the Legion becoming increasingly proficient in counterinsurgency operations, its soldiers actually enjoyed this form of warfare.
At this time, thanks to the experience they had acquired during the past year and a half, and also to their having been employed during the last 3 months in continually chasing the enemy from place to place through the wildest country it is possible to imagine, the men of my company had become splendid jungle fighters. Each of them was now not only a hardened, almost fever-proof soldier, but also a good shot and an efficient scout, ever on the alert to notice each sign by the way, to catch each sound in the air and understand their meaning. Conversant with the enemy's methods of fighting in the dark glades and somber thickets of his favorite haunts, the legionnaires and their officers had learnt to trust no longer to the paths, but to advance swiftly yet silently through the undergrowth, taking advantage of every bit of cover and making of each tree in the wood, each rise in the ground, a temporary rampart. Encouraged by their officers, the men took delight in this new sport, which seemed more like a hunt, in which the quarry was a man than regular warfare. The fact of their not being continually in touch with their officers and NCOs, and having consequently to depend sometimes on their own resources, developed their individual initiative and self-reliance, whilst the novelty of the situation gave full scope to their courage and love of adventure. Perhaps with troops possessing less stamina and morale, even these short periods of independent action would have been dangerous. But with these well-disciplined and seasoned soldiers of the Legion, this new method of attack seemed to increase the zeal and self-confidence of the men.
In Tonkin, the Legion had once again demonstrated its skills in colonial warfare, consolidating the fearsome reputation gained in Africa.